Welcome to On the Rise. I am Evan Murray, and this is awesome. We're here to talk about all the fun facts of Chinese language music. All right, so tell me, let's talk about memories. What are some of the most memorable things that happened to you performing in front of non-Chinese speaking audiences?
Good and bad. I've been booed off of almost booed on a 5,000 person stage at Transmusicale. And I've also just felt like the most powerful person on earth on some other stages, like this college town. I think it was called Man, but I'm probably getting it wrong. There's a YouTube video of it somewhere because we uploaded it, where it was like kind of my I'd been in a rock band a couple of times and I've done some stupid stuff drunk. This was the first time where I actually went into something sober and did and I just got like so incredibly high off the performance that I completely lost my shit. And I came out of it pretty bruised and I was surprised I didn't get killed. But it was a moment, like you have like that moment as a performer. You're like, I'm the king of the world. I'm the most badass human being on earth. Oh, wow. And I did that purely on adrenaline. And that was a moment because I think that was a moment when I transitioned from like being a performer to being like like something else, like the idea of being a rock star, whatever that means. Yeah. No.
Yeah.
No,
what do you say to that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, like that was an Aussie moment when I bit off the bat's head, like that was the moment.
moment. There you go.
Yeah. It was my Aussie moment, and but I was like, God damn it, that's so rock and roll, and it felt good, and it was really cool, and that kind of I was unsustainable. I think I remember Jay Leotard. Which was a very sad story. He used to crush like full cans of beer on his head on stage, and eventually he died of a brain aneurysm. So I always remember that whenever I perform it, like, okay, there's a line. He crossed that line, and no matter it doesn't work so well.
I want to talk to you a little bit about Canada for a minute. So, like you were growing up, you were born in Beijing, but you were growing up in the United States. Was there any main differences that you can identify between Canada and the places that you've lived?
It's cold.
Yeah, totally.
It's like other Canadians are like, wow, great observation. There's lots of maple syrup. You guys have like this weird fetishism about a leaf. Like it's everywhere. Like you just put a maple leaf on it and everybody worships it. Oh, it's a maple leaf. Like let's build a shrine, let's have dances, somebody get some ganja. Like, but yeah, I mean, generally, no, Canadians are nice. I was in Calgary and I was very young. And my family wasn't doing so well at the time because we actually got stuck. We don't do a lot of travel planning. I'm stuck here in Berlin. At the time we were stuck in Calgary. So, but at the time, my mom stupidly thought that her U.S. visa, student visa, would not have any problems if she crossed over the Canadian border. Because we were quite silly and ill-informed. So she went there to visit some relatives for the summer and to like pick up some work, or, she didn't even get any work, but then after 2 weeks, we're like, okay, well, that was fun. Let's go back. And we had relatives in Calgary, right? So we started driving back across the border, and then we got to the border and they said, I'm sorry, ma'am, but you are not allowed to leave the country. You're going to have to go and see the immigration police. And then we spent basically 6 months with a lawyer in Canada trying to get back to the US. And during that time, we had to go to school.
You know what? I completely believe you too, because like I don't care what anybody says. Like even going back into my own country, like Canada has the most strict border patrol people in the world. Like I've never been to another country where they're as conservative and as like investigative, as Canadian. And I mean, maybe that's really weird for people to hear that, or people don't realize that, but like going into the States is like a joke compared to like,
well, we were trying to return to the States.
Canadians. Yeah. But I mean, that's the thing. But if you had to encounter the Canadians first in order to do that, I mean,
Yeah.
it's yeah.
I don't really know what happened because I was too young and the process was like 9 years old. All I remember was my mom having this like look of like just pale white
Horror.
horror on her face and then making frantic phone calls on a payphone to my dad. And then like, packing up our stuff and then driving back to Calgary and to basically stay in our
That's like a 7 hour drive to the border, I think, too. Like
yeah,
that's not a short little,
it
yeah.
was insane. I think we stopped it was pretty insane. The whole process was insane. But then when
Like
we got back to
Lethbridge is down
Calgary,
there. Like
yeah,
you would have
and
had to go,
we
yeah, yeah.
yeah, it was weird. Like the whole thing was just so I didn't start off in Canada on the right foot. It was kind of like,
Just the
oh,
other
we're in
foot.
Canada, the country that jails us. Like we're
Right.
stuck in a basement in our friend's house in Calgary until she was able to like pick up some random labor job so we can at least move out of their basement. Because it wasn't like a pleasant place to
Wow.
stay. And we, co-rented an apartment with a friend of ours that apparently did the same thing as us. So not only did we screw ourselves over, but we screwed over our mates that came with us to Calgary. And then we just tried our best to survive for 6 months and get as much money as we can to pay for immigration attorneys. And I remember she
God,
was
that's
working.
interesting. That's like
Yeah,
such an, there's the podcast right there. Like, let's talk, like adventures in Canada. You know what I
in
mean? Like, they're
Calgary. We didn't see the
like, my
rest of
God,
Canada.
no, because I know how cold it is there and I know how rough it is there. Like, people are like, oh, you're Canadian, you're so friendly. I'm like,
But
speaking about Canada and being friendly and all these things, have you ever heard of the Junos?
the June, no, that's the thing. I know very little. I mean, I did, but after I left Calgary, I did see the rest of Canada. I actually quite liked it, but I don't know much about the Junos. I only know CMW. That's how uninformed I am. Like
So
it.
CMW is Canadian Music Week, and that's the
Mhm.
showcase conference. And I've worked with those people, and I think they're great people in the
Yeah.
past. And the Junos. So for anyone listening, I mean that's I guess what you'd say the Canadian equivalent to the Grammys,
Okay.
where it's like the music, the most prestigious award for Canadian artists, and sadly, sad to say that I mean, a lot of Canadians don't even know what the Junos are, and when you go outside of Canada, it's almost like nobody knows what the Junos are,
Right.
and that's I think Canadians need to wake up to that a little bit because the thing is that like I think that if there was, per se, a Chinese language music award show in Canada, I think a lot of people outside of Canada might be paying attention to that and
Yeah.
paying attention to Canada. You know what I'm saying?
I
Um,
yeah. Like there's a part of Junos. Like here's a Chinese language part of the Junos. Like we're not just doing music for like the English speaking part of the world. We're gonna embrace our multiculturalism in a totally different like level, than
well, when you
that
talk about
bullshit.
famous Canadians, like there's what, like a handful, but
Well, there's
in
quite a
Canada,
few.
but there's quite a few. But in Canada, we have so like because I'm born and raised in Canada, like we
Yeah.
have, and I know this for sure because living outside of Canada, and I was a musician myself for years, touring outside of Canada. Is that we have this depth of perception, like somehow we think the world knows or cares about Canada, and the thing is like,
Hey, that's
well, no,
very
honestly,
self.
I was in a rock band in India, and we're
Yeah.
sitting around with we have a Swedish guy, and there's three Indian guys, and we're playing tracks from each other's countries, and I was like, I couldn't believe these guys hadn't heard these bands I was playing for them. I'm like, you've never heard of these guys? And they're just like, why would we have heard of these guys?
But
But as
there's
a
like
Canadian,
so
I'm
many
I'm just
Canadians, like
like, oh my
Arcade
God, I thought
Fire
these
is
guys were
Canadian.
famous.
Yeah. Oh
Yeah.
God.
You know.
But I think that's the problem with Canada being so successful in the music industry. Like I was signed to a Canadian label for like a minute. But like Indica for like a minute, like,
Right, right.
but
There's
I
a
think it's very
difference.
uninteresting to the audience. So let's skip that part.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So with the Junos, I mean that's kind of part of what we're trying to identify here is just that maybe the Canadian music industry would be more international if Canada recognized its international population and connected
I,
it,
I
leveraged it to the outside, to the rest of the world, because I think that's how Canada will find more of its success. Because Canada, we don't have a big population. We're a big country, but we don't have a big population. And
incredibly
the
diverse
population
though.
we have, yeah, it's incredibly diverse, right? Like, I
Yeah.
mean, it's incredibly diverse, and I think that's our strength as Canadians is to try to, kind of unify that under a flag, like under the Canadian flag, but also like appreciate and respect our differences culturally, right, and ethnic, uh, so that's kind of where we're at with this whole entire Jade Music Festival and trying to elevate the Chinese languages. We just see that, like, how many more people would be paying attention to an award show, like I said, if there was a Chinese language component to it. I mean, it would be quite significant. Um,
I I totally support that. I mean, I think right now there's just so many anti-Asian narratives, especially anti-Chinese language or anti-Chinese narratives right now that
can you talk to me
because
a
it,
little bit about that?
oh dude, I mean, come on. Like there's like little things that I'm noticing because having been on the other side, the Miss Saigon, era, um it was like this gradual opening up of things happening and more Asian artists coming to the forefront from different backgrounds, like being cool for once, like just like mind blowing, like, oh dude, we're not just a nerdy kid with the IT background anymore, we're like cool. Whoa. uh, like that moment where Chinese and Asian American in general, Asian Canadian musicians, comedians, actors, when Asian males no longer were like, there were like just so many things happening where like, Lord would go and date an Asian guy. And then everybody would go jump on social media and say, why are you dating him? He's so ugly and everything. And it was just like exploding
Oh my
everywhere. And then
God.
and then there was like this pushback where she was like, screw you guys, he's good looking to me. And if you can't see it, that's because you're racist, and then seeing that pushback start happening, whereas before we had accepted the racism as truth. And then somebody finally coming to our defense and the new narrative being built, to see that kind of in the last kind of coming, and with brands like 88 Rising coming up, and then all of a sudden to suddenly feel the shift again in the air, when the violence started happening, when the portrayals in media started shifting again. It was just like something that kind of, you were so numb for so long that when you finally taste something, like the flavor of it just explodes in your mouth, that you can also taste the difference when the numbness starts to return. The power, the strength of culture itself is how much it flows from one group of people to the other group of people. Not that it subsumes, not that it takes over and covers everything that they are. Like, for instance, like a lot of artists in 88
But
Rising,
it
they're in their
flavors. It's
native
like
language.
it
It
becomes a part of
flavors,
the
yeah,
flavor, right?
right. Pepper doesn't come from Europe, but Europeans put pepper on everything, and it's the way that we talk about cooking. If the Italians didn't grow tomatoes before they went to the Americas, it's everything kind of goes and transitions and shifts. And when you accept that, then you break down the lines that colonialism created. What colonialism says is that, okay, for the dominant culture, they're allowed to take everything. They're allowed to, like,
Mm.
Grimes is allowed to walk around in T-Pow, but Asians are not allowed to do anything that be considered white people or for Black people, because you're Asian, you need to walk around in T-Pow permanently. Now that's colonialism. That's the way the colonialism thinks. You have a dominant culture that is allowed to take everything from all the other cultures, and then you have a smaller culture which is only allowed to stay in its corner.
So what we're doing in Canada is that we're trying to elevate the Chinese languages. And what I see in 88 Rising is like it's more about ethnicity, right? Like, and it's not about like a Chinese. It's not about
Yeah, but what is Chinese?
Thailand.
Like,
It's well, exactly, right. What is
yeah,
Chinese? Because I mean, then you have to go into languages, and I mean that's an interesting thing to say in itself. But I mean, And God, like that's another open door, right?
There's
Into
a lot
another
of
set
open
of
doors when it
rooms.
comes to culture. You know, like I
Yeah,
have a,
yeah,
yeah, I mean, the Beatles went to India and learned the sitar, put it into their music, and nobody ever said that the Beatles were being un-British.
right.
Well, maybe one or
Yeah,
two
there you
people,
go.
but yeah, there was like a couple
No,
of
no, but no,
Russian people who said it,
what
but
you're saying, I think
yeah,
I have to support you in what you're saying is because it was like, oh, look how cool that is. No one said like, oh my
yeah.
God, you're not British anymore. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. I know.
exactly.
Yeah,
You don't eat kippers and just play, you know, like music a certain way. Like, you know, it's not all pub tracks, you know, you're actually taking stuff from the United States because a lot of the dominant stuff that we consider dominant, you know, musicians in rock and roll, they're derivative of something that wasn't them. You know, they went
right,
and they copied somebody else. Except we accept it. And here is where race comes in because of the fact that they are not the other. They are the dominant culture. So, you know, when you are not a dominant culture, what colonialism did in the 18th century and 17th, 18th, and 19th, even now in Africa, what happened in Rwanda is that they started subdividing groups into very small units and saying, you stay in your group, you know, you're in arbitrarily. If you're Asian, then, you know, whatever country, whatever region, then you have to stay in your corner. You know, you can't take anything from any other groups. You're blackfishing or you're anglifying. You know, a lot of these terms are basically said that, you know, Post Malone is allowed to be whatever he wants to be, but you can't use hip hop. But it's you know, we have about this is a really weird era because this is the first time in uh, the last, I would say, 500-600 years where it's no longer about the idea of a dominant culture and then all of us as the other in our own little groups, where we really kind of looking at what post colonialism means and having all these ideas cross over. And there's a pushback. I think that pushback, you know, rides on the back of everything it can get on, you know, whether it's cancel culture or it's, you know, political correctness. But the truth is, it's all part of a pushback against people being able to break down the walls of the definitions that have been set up for hundreds of years of what they can and what they can't be. And this is the first time since the Me Too movement, since, you know, everybody saw how obviously wrong it was when Trump came into office, that there is even a debate out there about this. And unfortunately, you know, race does not dictate what side of the debate you are on. Its mentality does, and education does. Not like in higher education, so far as educating yourself through these systemic education, but like reading and talking to different kinds of people. I've just been very lucky in my life so far as I've traveled to different areas. I've talked to different groups of people. I've had this media background that allowed me so much access that I wouldn't normally have. And I've also been in the band, which also gives you a weird level of access. Because once you get on that stage, once you get off that stage, that's to me one of the most precious times you can have. Because that interaction with the group of people you have off stage, when you get off that stage, and talking and understanding them is really more important than, you know, the hours before where you're sound checking, getting to the hotel, traveling through customs. You get set there, you set up, you play, and if you do a good show, then it opens the door of communication to a group of people that maybe you wouldn't have had access otherwise.
well,
That's where
let me hop on your train here and then start going on going on a parallel track here. Why did you choose to be a musician in the first place?
I don't think I chose it. I think it just happened. You know, like my parents decided they wanted me to learn music before I was born, and I did. Like very Asian. Like there's always kind of like the Asians. Like there's a lot of over planning, but you take to some stuff and you don't take to others. My parents were like, oh, she's going to be an athletic musician. Well, athletics didn't really work for me, so the music did, and it's like, you know, with kids, and I'm raising a child now. You're raising kids. You realize that they're like a fertile field, but not all the seeds are going to grow. So as a parent, you kind of your early job is just to throw as many seeds in there as possible and see which one starts to get like a little bit of a sprouting, and then just try and water it and feed it as much as you can without overstepping your bounds. And that's and just also giving them a certain amount of freedom. Sometimes what grows is not something you expect. You think it's a weed, but if you let it flourish, it might turn out to be something absolutely gorgeous that you hadn't even imagined before. As a parent. But this is all stuff a learning process of how it works. So with my parents, it was kind of like they were like they threw in all these seeds, but then they kind of got consumed by the necessities of their own life, of the financial needs. But I grew up in a time before they took away arts funding. So in the United States, in the 80s, before Piss Jesus, which it was a particular artwork that actually defunded the all the arts programs in the U.S. Somebody from a lower income household had access to museums, had access to music education, dance education. It was for my parents. They couldn't afford childcare, but they could drag me to a class, put me there. At the time, they didn't have a cell phone, so they would just drop me off, drive very quickly to do whatever they would needed to do, and then come back and pick me up. And they would put me in as many classes as possible as a form of childcare, but it was all free and it was paid for by the state, or it cost very little money, like $1 US per class, which was way less than the babysitter. So they did this in part because they needed the time, and also because they wanted to plant as many seeds in my field as possible, to see what grows. And I was a benefit of that because the arts funding existed at that time. In the late 80s, they took that away from the kids. But by then I already found my interests, already found my abilities. And so it wasn't so hard. And my financial situation with my family had also improved. So it wasn't that difficult for me to continue on the path that had been laid out for me on the back of all this experimentation when I was younger. And that's not there anymore. I think a lot of the problems we have right now with music is that a lot of musicians come from similar backgrounds, which is middle class to wealthy families that can afford to do music. Whereas before, right. I started out in a working class family that needed childcare. So they use the government programs to their advantage. And I got a great education in the arts because of it.
All right. What languages do you speak?
I speak Chinese and English. And
what kind of Chinese language do you speak?
Mandarin Chinese, okay, like Beijing Hua. And with a very, very clear Beijing accent. I go from like a relatively intelligent person to sounding like I grew up in the Hutongs, with like a wife beater and a cigarette hanging out of my mouth, like proper Beijing, old school, like Hutong. It does, like, for me, like I think having a second language was never so valuable to me until I went back to China the first time. And then at the time I didn't speak Chinese as well as I do now, because you lose a lot of it when you're growing up in the US. And I just remember, like, one day when I couldn't bait anything. I couldn't understand half what people were saying half the time, especially when they used difficult like words. I couldn't understand the news. But then over time you do, and then you realize, wow, okay, that's when you start perceiving things differently. Having two full languages means that language is not just information. Language is a way of processing information. No, I mean, I think you can't. There's a lot of stuff that doesn't work with direct translation because the concept doesn't even work in that language. So once you really do embrace and get deeper into a language, you're really opening up your brain to a whole way of thinking. And it was just, I remember, like, it was kind of a rush. I loved it. And I still do. I feel like I'm not there yet. I feel like if I had time, I would devote more time to it. I speak a tiny bit of German, but it's actually regressed since I've been in Berlin, because I've been listening to mostly English audiobooks and talking to my Chinese friends. So actually my German regressed since I've been in Berlin.
All right. Teach me something in Chinese.
Okay. I think我酒精中毒，就是我酒精过敏，which means I'm allergic to alcohol. It's a good thing to
I
say.
actually need to learn to say that
Yeah,
actually.
我酒精过敏,
My life
我酒精过敏.
would improve.
Yeah. Exactly, because you know how Asians are. Like it's the one thing that stops them from making you drink like 50 like shots just to prove that like you're on the same. And they're dying too. Like they need an excuse, honestly, to stop drinking. So you just have to say, 我酒精过敏，我酒精过敏，再太多了，我待会儿得去急诊了. Just saying, I'm going to the emergency room. If you guys give me any more, because I'm allergic to this stuff.
Okay, wait. Slow down. So how do I say, hey, I'm allergic to alcohol? How do I say that again?
我酒精过敏，酒精过敏，
我进过敏，
allergic to alcohol.
我就进
酒精
过
酒精 is alcohol, and
给酒
过敏
精。
means allergic.
Okay, so Wu is I, and
Yeah,
then the next one is
酒精过敏，
Joe to Jinglewen.
过敏
To
Guomin 过敏.
Guomin.
I have a feeling some Asian people are going to go, okay, now you're butchering it too. Like,
Sorry.
screw you.
Yeah.
Chinese language
No, I'm
show.
so bad. I'm trying, I'm learning a little bit here and there, but it's not an easy language to learn coming from an English. Well, no, I almost feel like I learned the wrong language first, I think, because I don't know how other people feel, but like I've even been told by other people, like learning other languages from English is kind of difficult. Per se, is like, say if you were already speaking, say French and then learning Portuguese or like Spanish or
Yeah, but they're
something
all
like
part of
that.
the romantic language, background.
Right. They're all
It's
kind
like
of
they
right.
have one basis. And English is like
Yeah.
this little bastard, a cross between Germanic and romantic and like other, and it's just all like smushed
Yeah.
together. And American English is like, none of the above. It's like basically a bunch of people that were too lazy to enunciate. And then it was just like, okay, we'll just mix it up. And then yeah, it's I think like language, or not American English, but like, North American English. Sorry about that, Canadians. But
It's okay.
it's like, ooh, you said that. Ooh, stupid American. You still think we're all one country, huh? Like, but yeah, I think language is important. And if you have a kid that's like starting it, the exposure for language, like how I learned Chinese eventually, even though I had a foundation in Chinese, was watching a lot of Stephen Chow films. Like they had this like old school Chinese guy that dubbed him, but the dubs were always very clearly enunciated. And it was kind of hilarious, but you had to know what they were saying. So like, it was kind of like, we would be it was my early 20s, and I had like decided to study Chinese again because I was really at a disadvantage. I was illiterate. I couldn't read in Chinese at that time. And, my speaking level was very low. And here I was back working in China and I needed it. So I took some classes, and, all the literature they gave me were like really boring. Like, oh, this is my friend. I'm going to give him some apples. Let's go give him some apples. And I was like, I don't need this shit. And then I was like, oh, Stephen Chow movies, like Zhou Xingqi. I was like, okay, yeah, like really bad 90s style comedy from Hong Kong. Why not? And you watch enough of those movies, and your language skills like improve dramatically. And I learned that, yeah, I mean, that's how all the Europeans are learning English. They just watch a lot of American movies.
Repetition, right? You're talking about repetition, like you just
right. It's not
like
repetition. It's like I want to know what's going on.
Okay.
Yeah. Like you're in the flow of communication. You're not like memorizing like this random set of numbers and digits and rules. And you just forget. And I think that's why so many Europeans speak English compared to Americans speaking and their languages. They're just not watching enough movies. They're not watching enough movies. They're not being exposed to enough media from those other countries, because American entertainment systems have been so dominant and so rejectionist of everything from the outside.
And That's it, folks. Please continue to listen to the next parts or continue to the next episode. Please don't forget to hit subscribe and follow On the Rise. This is awesome.